you are a regular user of the internet, you may know that there's a huge number of Catholic websites out there, including some that list every saint who's ever lived, according to the day of the year on which their feast day is celebrated. Click on any day of the year and you will find a fascinating variety of saints, ancient and modern, most of whom you'll never have heard of, except perhaps as the name of some French or Italian village you've been to on holiday, St. Quentin, for example, or, I don't know, Saint somebody rather by the sea. Saints, of course, that we actually celebrate throughout the year in our churches are those who are considered more important for everyone to know about and venerate, or perhaps saints associated with a particular country or region. In England, for example, we celebrate St. Augustine of Canterbury, who brought the gospel to Kent over 1400 years ago. And one of the reasons we have today's Feast of All Saints is that there are simply too many saints for us all to celebrate individually. There is another reason, too, which comes out very strongly in the readings the Church gives us today. And that is that we are all of us called to be holy. In fact, when St. Paul wrote his letters to his recently founded churches, he often addressed them to the saints in Philippi, Thessalonica, or wherever. He was writing to us, he'd say, I'm writing to the saints in Notting Hill, meaning by that all the Christians in that place. St. John Paul II frequently issued a similar call in his talks to young people, saying to them, do not be afraid to desire to be a saint. One of the reasons we might be afraid to want to be a saint is that we think holiness is only for a special kind of person. Monks, nuns, people who suffer a lot, and that being a saint is mainly about self-denial, doing without the usual joys of life, in fact possibly something rather miserable and unattractive. But as someone once said, a sad saint is a contradiction in terms. Holiness is a joyful affair, a path to inner peace, and above all, an expression of a deep love for God and for our neighbour. Heaven, the home of the saints, is depicted in today's first reading as a place of overwhelming happiness in the glory of God's presence. And the Gospel we heard at the beginning of the famous Sermon on the Mount tells us about people who are truly happy or blessed. Now it's true that as the second reading tells us, the path to happiness involves a purification from our sins, which is often painful. But the goal of that purification is not some kind of sterile moral perfection, but a life overflowing with love, peace and joy, because it is sin and not the search for holiness that makes us miserable. Now, of course, one of the main places we find joy in our lives, and also the best path to holiness for many people, is in our family life. And that's why Pope Francis recently held a synod, that is, a meeting of bishops from around the world, to reflect together on family life. You may have seen some rather distorted accounts of this synod on the television, or the internet, or newspapers. So our Archbishop, Cardinal Nicholas, has written us a letter about it, copies of which are available at the back of church, or can be found very simply by Googling Cardinal Nichols Pastoral. One of the lovely phrases that came up at the synod, he reports, was to see the family as a sanctuary of holiness. A sanctuary of holiness. And yet the synod also faced the reality that as well as the joys of family life, there are also at times great sorrows. And I know some of you here have experienced those to a greater or lesser extent. There are people whose family life has been disrupted by war and enforced migration. There are those who've been through the incredibly painful experience of marriage breakdown and divorce, to say nothing of bereavement. The newspaper headlines focused especially on two areas which were discussed by the Synod: how to help those who are divorced and remarried, and how to welcome those who experience same-sex attraction and often feel the Church is pretty negative about it. But behind these questions there is, I think, a deeper one that all of us struggle with. We hear the Sermon on the Mount. We know it's the sublime summary of all the moral and spiritual teaching of Christ. But can it really be observed by people like us? Is it perhaps only meant, as some people have thought, for a kind of spiritual elite? For monks and nuns and special people? Once again, we are tempted here to see holiness as reserved for special people, overlook that Christ addressed his sermon to all those who wanted to follow him, not just to his apostles. Indeed, he proposes the Beatitudes, the reading we heard, as a path to true happiness for all human beings made in God's image. So if we are all called to holiness, what is the path to holiness for people whose marriage has broken down and have remarried? Or for people who are living together, often with children, but haven't yet been able to bring themselves to take that step of marriage? Or for those who experience same-sex attraction? Are such people excluded from the search for holiness? Relegated to a kind of second class in the Church? And if they're not, why should they be excluded from receiving the sacraments, which after all are the main support we expect to receive if we're to follow Christ seriously? These were the questions the Synod on the Family grappled with. It has to be said they didn't come up with definite answers. Another Synod next year will hopefully clarify things more. After all, there can be no question of changing Christ's teaching on marriage, but the sacred purpose for which we were given the gift of our sexuality, especially in a world where lifelong commitment is often considered impossible, and sex is often reduced to having a bit of fun. No one can pursue the path of holiness on his or her own. No one can be joyful and loving without the support of the whole Church. So whatever answers the Synod comes up with must provide a concrete path to holiness for all of us. Whether our family life and sexuality are happy experiences, or whether they're marked by pain and misunderstanding. I hope that here in the parish next Lent, following on from the successful series of talks and discussions we had earlier this year about scandals in the Church, we'll be able to hold some more talks on family life and on these thorny issues, so that we too may play our part in preparing the next Synod. Let us not forget to pray for our Holy Father and our bishops, especially Cardinal Nichols, as they ponder these weighty matters, and seek to guide us all on that path by which we hope to join all the saints in heaven, and to help us also to reach out to invite many others who do not yet know Christ in this Church to do the same.